Yeah, welcome. So let's start. Uh, Slightly different from the other talks that we've been doing. I've decided I want to try just sitting down for this one instead of standing by the board and drawing pictures for you. But the sort of overarching theme or logo for this entire talk is, of course, Hemingway's famous iceberg. What he said very rightly is that the dignity of movement of an iceberg lies in only 1/8 of it being above the water. And something interesting is going to happen today with that metaphor, because when we're listening, we have to remember that we're listening for that dignity of movement. We're trying to recognize in somebody else's speech dignity of movement. We're trying to recognize what's under the surface. We're trying to get at what's deep about this. What is it that I can use in this to build my own iceberg of knowledge, right? So I'm not going to draw that iceberg, but I will put a picture of it out along with the notes for this particular talk. This connects to everything else we're doing, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. That the art of listening is something that we maybe don't notice often enough. We don't think about it often enough. We just imagine that it's something we're able to do as part of our language competence, as part of our learning competence. But really, it's as much of an art as writing or reading or thinking that we've been working on. And it's a really nice setup to the talk we're going to have next week, which is on the art of talking. Some people say, welcome, come on in. Some people say that the art of, oh, they're not coming in. Some people would say that if you're going to learn to fight, then you should learn first how to heal. And maybe this is has kind of the same kind of connection, that the art of listening is something that's sort of a preparatory art, something we should develop before we ask other people to listen. We should develop this ourselves, right? So I'm really going to encourage you to think about it as a coherent package of competencies. Listening is something we do a lot of. It's a little bit like reading. It's a little bit like thinking. But it's definitely something that's really worth developing explicitly. I'm going to, of course, get to the idea of learning how to listen to a lecture, because that's going to class and paying attention and getting something out of a class is something that we really need to be able to do at a university. But I want to start somewhere else. The reason I mention it now is that you're kind of in that listening mode here. You're going to be listening for about 45 minutes. You're expecting to get something out of it. I have to do some work to give you something there, right? But of course, you have to have some kind of strategy, some kind of plan for how to listen to this. So you'll feel a little bit cheated if in 40 minutes I explain to you, or in maybe half an hour or so I get to how to listen to a lecture, and then you've missed the first 30 minutes of it because you weren't prepared to listen to a lecture, right? And then I tell you what the secret is. So in order to not put you in that situation where you feel like we should have heard this about half an hour ago, I'm going to say something that is very, very useful when you're listening to a lecture, and that is to get a sense of what the lecturer's plan is in the first few minutes of the lecture. Usually they'll be quite open about it. They'll say what they're about to do. And what you then need to do, either on your note page or just in your mind, is you need to sort of begin to anticipate what's going to happen and expect certain things. The great thing about expectation is that it allows you to be disappointed. Once you have developed expectations of the speaker, you've said, okay, I've given what you said in the first 5 minutes, I'm expecting you to talk about these various things. You can make a note to yourself of whether or not there were things that were not dealt with as you thought they would be. Topics that were not treated, information you did not get out of it. Now, that might be because you missed it. because you weren't paying attention, right? That is possible. But it's also possible that the speaker is a human being and forgot to say something that they had planned to say. So they told you what the plan was, and then they forgot to say it. I'm definitely guilty of this at times. So this is certainly, it could happen today. And of course, that's why most lecturing situations are either followed, as we do in this situation, by a Q&A, where those questions that you then have can be raised. Or some speakers will say right in the beginning, just interrupt me if you have any questions, if there's anything that you need me to say more about. So do please do that. I'm going to invite you to do that. If there is something where you feel like I need to interrupt here to really follow along, then go ahead. That's fine with me. But you're also welcome just to leave the questions until the end. And like I say to the people online, you can put your questions in the chat, and I will try to get to them as I go. So what am I going to do today? What am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about really three things, three different occasions on which we listen. And the first one is going to be listening in conversation. So what I'm talking about there is live, actual conversation when you're talking to somebody and you're exchanging things back and forth. That's one kind of listening that we do a lot of at university. And it's a place where we really sometimes don't notice how much of an art it is and how good some people are at it. Some people are really good at participating in a conversation and then listening, hearing things and getting things out of the information they're getting. And there's an art to that. There are some strategies that you can use. And of course, there's a lot of reasons that that's difficult. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. I then want to talk about what we sometimes call interventions. So one is a conversational situation, and then there's interventions. And this is what we refer to when somebody is either on a panel of several speakers, and then their contribution to that panel, we sometimes call that their intervention. So we'll refer to it, we'll say, oh, John, in your intervention on this panel, you said so and so when we're asking questions, right? So that's one kind of speech act or performance that we can make when we talk. So it's one kind of thing we can listen to. And the same sort of thing will happen in a seminar situation. So if you have a relatively informal seminar or colloquium, somebody may make a short presentation at the beginning. And then other people will have a chance to make their interventions, right? So they'll produce something. The thing about those kinds of things is they're usually a little bit shorter than a lecture. So they'll be maybe 10 or 15 minutes, or as short as 5 minutes. They'll still be monologues. They'll often be a little more improvised than a lecture. And often they'll come out of something that was said on the panel before, right? Or something that was said in the seminar, and then somebody will intervene. Somebody will make an intervention into that. So that's another kind of listening that is worth considering. And it's obviously different from conversation, right? Because it's not a back and forth situation. It's a monological performance. And then I want to talk finally about a presentation, about a lecture form, right? So where somebody has prepared something in advance and is going to deliver it to you as a presentation, will present their views for you, and that requires a different act of listening. It also gives you a lot more resources for that listening. It makes it easier for you to work with it in many ways. It's also longer, so the risk of getting bored is certainly more present. And it's challenging for the speaker, of course, to keep the attention of the audience for that long, 45 minutes or even longer sometimes. So definitely be kind and charitable as an audience when somebody is speaking like that. And then remember that there's a lot of work you're going to be doing to retain it. So we'll talk about that. So that's three things I'm going to talk about. And I said I'm going to spend about 45 minutes talking, right? So in your minds, you should be thinking, well, probably about three things, probably about equal time. So I'm going to need to maybe already start putting on my note sheet, right? Oh, there's going to be something about conversation. There's going to be something about interventions, and there's going to be something about presentations, right? And then notice the artfulness of the mnemonic that I've created there, right? Instead of saying conversation, panel discussions, and presentation and lectures, I've come up with 3 words that kind of sound the same, right? So it's conversation, intervention, and presentation. And one of the things to listen for when somebody is presenting their views in those kinds of slogans and phrases is, okay, what are they using that for, right? How are they helping that to organize their thoughts? And how can that be a use to me when I'm listening, right? But I'll get into more detail about what you can do with a lecture. I just wanted to give you that right at the beginning so you know that, okay, we're going to do about 10 minutes on conversation, about 10 minutes on intervention, and about 10 minutes on presentation. And then if my math is right, then we're getting around the hour, right? Good. So what is what's the deal with conversation? One of the reasons that I find conversation such an important thing to develop an understanding of when you're going to school and when you're thinking about all the other intellectual pursuits that you're going to be combining as a part of your university studies, is that it really grabs a hold of a guiding metaphor for academic writing, academic discourse, research in general. And that's this idea that research is a conversation, right? So research itself is a conversation among peers who are trying to understand the world better. And given that research is metaphorically a conversation, it's very, very useful to you to pay attention when you are engaged in conversation with your peers. And by peers here, of course, very much mean your fellow students, right? So your peers will be people you can have conversations with. That conversation will be about the things you've learned in your courses, the things you are learning and trying to understand. And so that's an academic conversation. That's an example of what we're talking about when we say the whole business of learning at university is conversational, right? Or what we sometimes call discursive, right? There's discourse involved. And then just remember that that's a very gradual process in which you form your thoughts in a conversational framework. But what's distinct about real, actual, non-metaphorical conversations, right? When you actually sit there and talk to somebody, what's distinct about them? Well, first of all, you're unlikely to be taking notes, right? So unlike in this situation where you are free to take notes and there's nothing rude about it, right? I mean, in fact, some speakers take it as an act of great politeness. People are taking notes. If you're taking a lot of notes while you're engaging in conversation, that's almost kind of disruptive. That's kind of rude, and it distracts a little bit from somebody's stream of thought, as if you're sitting there writing down what they're saying, right? Are you going to be quoting me on this later? Or are you, right? That sort of thing. So that's one of the things that's really, really important is there isn't that record being kept of the conversation. And you'll notice this as well if you've ever tried to tape a conversation, that you really have to let the tape run for a while before the conversation starts to flow freely again, and people forget about it, right? So yeah, there's no record, no notes in principle when you're in conversation. It's a very active business, right? So the listening part of it is going to be quite active. And the reason for that is, of course, that while you're listening, and I think we've all had this experience, when you're having a conversation with somebody, while you're listening, you're also thinking of something to say. So there's constantly that thing going on in your head of, where's my opportunity to contribute? We're all raised to learn turn taking in some kind of way in conversation, right? So we as a speaker, we have to yield the conversation over to the other person, but the other person also has to be waiting, right? If sometimes when you are talking to somebody and you realize they're not listening because you're trying to hand the conversation back to them and they don't grab it, right? So, oh, you're thinking of something else, obviously, because otherwise at this moment you would have something to say. So that active component is very, very important, that we recognize that we're not just listening when we're conversing, we're also thinking, right? We're also forming our own thoughts in relation to what's being said. And the other thing that we then have to keep in mind is that some people are really good conversationalists. They're very persuasive. So while we're talking about something that they're telling us about and we're asking questions and they're telling us more things, we might be very easily swayed. We might be won over quite easily. We might be caught up and enthralled in the story in a way that we wouldn't be if we were reading it. Or even if we were watching it as a lecture, right, where we have a little more time just to think for ourselves. So we might get more caught up in it. We might be less critical. We might actually enjoy we might be enjoying the conversation. So we're really going to be feeling that pleasure of conversing with somebody, especially somebody who's good at it, right? So there's a kind of reflection you can make. If you want to develop the art of participating in a conversation, bringing your own thoughts into it, bringing your thoughts into confrontation with their thoughts. That's really the art here. And the interesting thing about this is, for those of you who participated in the How to Write lecture, or the How to Write talk, I should say, it's actually the same questions we raise when we ask, how are we going to write this paragraph, right? So once we've decided what we're going to say, we're going to ask ourselves, how are we going to say it, right? And we should be doing the same thing when we're listening to somebody speak in conversation. So they're going to say something to us, and now we have to ask ourselves, what rhetorical posture are they adopting? Are they trying to get me to believe this? Are they trying to get me to understand it? Or are they trying to get me to agree with them, right? What is their rhetorical purpose with this particular thing they're saying to me right now? And of course, that's something we can get from just the tone of their voice. We can get it from the context, of course, from body language, from the feeling that's being passed between us, but also just sometimes an explicit kind of statements that they make about it. But that's the speaker's intention. So one thing we're listening for is, what is the speaker trying to do? They're trying to get me to believe this, or they're trying to get me to understand it, or they're trying to get me to agree with it. But there's another question underneath that, which is the speaker getting my difficulty with the content that they're presenting right? Is the problem with the statement that they're making trying to get me to believe it, or trying to get me to understand it? Is my difficulty with this believing it, understanding it, or agreeing with it, right? Separate from what are they trying to do with it, right? And one thing we'll find in conversation when we're talking to people, if we realize, okay, you're debating with me about this, you're arguing this point to me as though I disagree with you, and the conversation is kind of going off the rails now because you assume I don't agree with you, and you're giving me all kinds of counter arguments to positions I don't hold. So we interrupt the speaker at that point, right? And we say, no, listen, I got it. I agree with you, right? But I don't quite understand what you mean by one thing or another, right? And then sometimes the art there is actually persuading the speaker, the person you're talking to, that you weren't being ironic when you said you don't understand. Like, you weren't just saying you disagree. Because sometimes we say, you know what, I don't understand about what you're saying, right? And what we really mean is, I understand what you're saying, I just disagree with you, right? And I'm arguing with you, right? So we have to get those things right. But one of the things that's really good to do in our own heads while we're listening, between our own ears, as it were, while we're listening, is to develop our own rhetorical posture. And we can call that kind of a listening posture, right? And we can say, given the subject that we're talking about, given the claims that are being made, right? What is my difficulty with it? What do I want? Do I want evidence? Do I want somebody to support these claims? Do I want some elaboration of them? Do I want it explained to me, right? Or do I want the person I'm talking to acknowledge my counter arguments and deal with them, right? defend themselves, right? Stand and defend yourself is what we want to say to the person we're talking to. If we do that explicitly, if we think about that as we're talking to somebody every once in a while, sometimes that can make the conversation go a lot better, right? Because we realize that the person we're talking to is off on a fool's errand, right? And what we want to do is say, well, this conversation will go better if I can convince you to try to get me to believe this instead of debating with me, right? Because I'm open to it. I just want evidence, right? So that sort of thing is very, very important. Another side of the persuasive thing is that once we've got all that settled, I know what posture I'm in as a listener. I can recognize my interlocutor's posture as a debating one or as a just supporting, justifying one. Then there's this whole very, very subtle art of face work, which has been studied sociologically and rhetorically for a long time, of making sure that the conversation proceeds in such a way that all the participants can save face, right? Sometimes we'll be disagreeing about things, and sometimes we use this, what I find to be kind of a boring phrase, which is, let's agree to disagree, right? I usually say, well, why don't we just disagree? Why do we have to agree to disagree? Why don't we just disagree for a little while longer and then let each other go each to each, right? And here's something I realized recently when I was thinking about what to say in this talk, is that I think the best conversations are the ones where the parties to the conversation are people who earnestly hope to change each other's minds, right? They want to contribute to each other's learning. So they want to make my mind, they want to enrich it with new information, or they want to disabuse me of mistaken beliefs, right? So there's a hope, there's a generosity on the part of the other person to contribute to my mental development, right? So they are hoping to change my mind, but they don't expect me to change my mind before the conversation is over. They will allow me to go and think about what we've talked about and let me change my mind over the following days. So they're not going to extract a victory from me in conversation. We're going to have the conversation, we're going to listen to each other, right? And then we're going to let those thoughts percolate slowly until all of the different ideas, I now have to make room for these new ones, right? So I have to move all these things around. That's going to take time. So one thing is that you hope to change you hope to change the other person's mind. You hope they change your mind, but you don't expect it to happen right now, right here, today, right? And this is also a good point. You don't expect the conversation to end just because your mind changes, right? It's not like that was the point, right? The conversation will have its own dynamic, and you'll respect that and let your mind change. And then at some point, the conversation will end on its own, regardless of where your mind ended up, right? So if you can keep those two things separately, that's really good. And that's a great way also of just maintaining this face work, right? That you don't at any point have to say, okay, and we now have agreed that I won this argument, right? Right? If we can skip that step and just let the conversation end, then we're much more open to listening, right? I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So at a certain level, the art of listening to a conversation is finding ways, always listening for ways of keeping it going, right? That's a respectful thing to do in a conversation. Of course, you may have time constraints. You may also at some point feel like, okay, now we are going in circles. There is no point in continuing this conversation. So at some point you end the conversation in a polite and mutual way. And of course, at that point, it's a really good idea to maybe even sit down and make some notes, right? Because at this point, you now want to retain some of the things that were said. At the very end of a conversation, we'll sometimes say, what was that book you mentioned or that paper you mentioned? Can I get the reference for that so I can look that up? So there can be a little bit of sort of cleaning up work at the end of it, a little bit of sort of housekeeping at the end. And then definitely make some notes of the thoughts you had and the ideas that you need to pursue. And then, of course, go back in your mind to this conversation, right? Reflect on it, and try to remember it. Just that act of trying to remember it the next day and the day after, and looking at your notes and thinking about it and this kind of thing is a really good, useful exercise. And it will sharpen your ear for the next time you have a conversation, right? If you reflect on how that conversation went. I guess as part of that, I should say, try not to do too much toe cringing, right? Where you are embarrassed about something that you said or forgot to say, or a way you pronounced a word or something like that. Try to let go of all of that. You can't change it, right? But you can take it into the next time you have a conversation, and then you can do it better, right? You can converse better next time. So that's the art of listening in a conversation. So how is it different now when we think about short interventions in panels or in seminars? In this case, what is usually happening is you're sitting as part of an audience, and the thing that makes it immediately different from a conversation is that there's no immediate pressure on you to acknowledge what's going on, to participate, right? To do any of that face work. As a member of the audience, you're entitled just to be anonymous and just make of it what you will. You don't have to tell anybody what you think. So remember to keep that in mind. I always think of many years ago, I was at during an election, I think it was during the Euro vote in Denmark many years ago, when we voted no to the Euro, and there was a panel of politicians presenting their views, and I was sitting very close to a group of people, or I think 2 or 3 people, who found it very difficult to hear things from a panel that they disagreed with, and just letting it go for now and waiting for the appropriate moment to intervene. And of course, that they just felt too present. Like they felt like if they let it go, if they don't heckle it, right, then everybody in the room is going to believe them, right? But of course, the thing you have to do there, the listening exercise there, is just to sit back and let it happen. Let these words be spoken to everybody. Let everybody hear them, right? And then recognize that your objection might be that you misunderstood it, right? It's possible, right? It's also possible you've understood it perfectly well, and you're right that they're wrong, right? But as a member of an audience, you're listening first and foremost and trying to figure this out. An issue with interventions like this on panels or at seminars is that you don't know how long they're going to go. There's a kind of almost a joke, kind of a famous line, a meme of sorts these days, where you preface a question by saying, "This isn't really a question, more of a comment." Right? And once somebody says that, there's a little bit of a hesitation in the room, a little bit of fear, because this could go on for a long time, right? So the thing that's different here between a conversation where you're participating and in control and can steer it, right? You can, and an intervention like this is you're going to let the person speak, and you're going to have to listen for an indeterminate amount of time, right? So you can't do this mapping it out. 10 minutes on conversation, 10 minutes on intervention, 10 minutes on presentation. You're going to have to just kind of say, okay, well, maybe it's just going to end abruptly and then it's finished, or maybe it's going to go on for a while. I don't know, right? So listening there is going to be, you're going to have a little more open platform. Fortunately, it's probably going to be about 10 or 15 minutes, right? So get comfortable with that. At this point, it's really useful to, and I forgot I did forget it. I've got my notebook, right? But you can imagine a little black notebook. At this point, it's really good. When I participate in seminars like that, I always bring the notebook I bring anyway, the one for jotting down my own ideas. And what I usually do is I'll put the name of the person who is intervening at the top of a page, and the date, maybe the title of the seminar that this is happening at. And then what I'll do is I'll write down anything they say that I find interesting, so any interesting phrases as quotations. I'll quote them, I'll put them in quotation marks. Anything that's not direct quotation, I'll just paraphrase. So I'll just write that as, notes, usually bullet points or something like that. And then my little trick here is to use square brackets to mark my questions or my thoughts about that. So on a little piece of note page, right, there'll be a name, so I know who it is that's saying these things. Some of it will be direct quotation, some of it will be paraphrase, and some of it will be my reaction to it. And my reactions I just put in square brackets. And that can be a very, very useful little thing to do. And of course, sometimes I will write the name and the date, and then the book page will be blank, right? And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind, and we'll get to this in the presentation part as well, is that blank note pages are immediately visually to you a reminder, right, that either you weren't paying attention, right, or nothing interesting was said, right? And so that can be like it's not wasted paper. It's because it's an immediate kind of reminder to you of an event, right? A nice visual presentation of that. Yeah, so the big distinction here is that you can make those notes without being rude in any way. What's interesting, though, about a intervention in a panel or in a seminar is that you're actually often invited to make your own when you're participating in these things. So it's almost like conversation, but in slow motion, right? So, or conversation with a lot of deliberation and reflection. So you're not actively participating in it, but somebody is monologuing at you. You're in a position to wait as long as you want and decide not to respond at all. You don't have to, right? And if your little piece of note page there and there's lots of stuff in square brackets, right, that you're interested in talking about, then you can begin to think about, how am I going to say this to this group of people at this moment, right? And am I going to say it as a question, or am I going to say it more as a comment, right? Am I going to present this as just my kind of input to this? And just remember that just like when you are listening in a conversation, you're activating parts of your mind, right? So that you can bring your ideas into contact with their ideas. Just in exactly the same way, when you're doing it as a set of interventions, right? And you're imagining your own intervention, that image of what you could say, right, is part of the way you listen. It gives form to how you listen, right? It prepares your mind to hear certain things, and it of course also causes you maybe to miss certain things, right? So that's important to keep in mind. All right, I've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. We're going to talk about this final kind of listening, which is listening to a formal presentation in a lecture or a class, right? And one of the things that's happening here that makes it quite a bit different from the other things we've been talking about is you're really going to be imputing to the speaker a lot of preparation and planning, right? So you're going to say, the thing that what we're expecting here is that I'm going to sit down and give this person, maybe these 20 or 30 or 100 or 200 people are going to give this one person their undivided attention for 45 minutes, right? So that person better have thought about how they're going to use that. And we're going to have certain expectations and requirements and demands of the speaker. And we bring those with us into the situation. And it's a more formal situation. But by a similar token, if we are going to imagine that the speaker has prepared, then we can also ask ourselves, did I prepare? right? Now, at university, as a student, there is a lot of really ordinary, simple things that are the preparation we're supposed to do, right? So obviously, there's going to be a reading list. There will be readings for that class, and the speaker is going to be prepared to talk to those readings, right? But the speakers also, the teacher is expecting the audience to be familiar with those readings, right? Because otherwise it would be a different kind of presentation, right? So you should, of course, have done the reading as part of your preparation for listening to this lecture. You should do the reading. And when you're doing the reading, you should remember that you're preparing to listen to a lecture, which is to say, you're going to imagine in advance that the teacher is going to be talking about these texts. Right? Now, I have attended university. Many of you have already attended many university classes. And so you know the disappointment that I'm just about now to talk about, which is I really read very carefully a text. I found it very, very interesting. I had lots of ideas about it, and I was looking forward to discussing it in class, and we didn't get to it, right? The teacher's plan for the class ended up getting caught up in some issue in a different text or a different problem we were talking about. And so we never got to the thing that I was really prepared to listen to and talk about, right? But just remember that that disappointment is part of your active listening, right? And you are learning something from that, just from what did I want to talk about and didn't get to talk about? What did I want to hear about and didn't get to hear about? Right? So keep that in mind. When you're preparing, you are preparing to get more out of a talk, even if that lecture is going to disappoint you on some points, and all lectures must disappoint. There's just no way around that. As you're reading, there's really two important things you can do when you're reading and preparing for a class. So if you are preparing for a class, you will have the readings, and you might even have a title for the class, like the class will have a certain topic that's going to be discussed in that class. And depending on the detail of the syllabus, there might be some description of what we're going to talk about that day, right? Use all of that information to generate questions, right? What are some questions that you would like answered in today's lecture, right? So you came to a talk today about how to listen, and what were some of the questions you had about listening that you were hoping would be dealt with, right? Just based on the very brief description of this talk, there's already some issues there. You can say, well, I expect to have these things answered or these things answered. So that's certainly one thing. Come up with questions and let that be your prepared mind. But the other thing you can do, and this is kind of a step you can do before you hear the teacher or the lecturer, the speaker say, I'm going to talk about 3 things today, right? So before you make that kind of mental, I need 10 or 15 minutes for this, 10 or 15 minutes for this, or 10 or 15 minutes for that, you could actually, before you even show up, have a sense of how you think this is going to go, right? And that's especially true with class. And it's especially true after you've had the same teacher for a few times, right? You start realizing how the class works, right? That there's a certain pattern to it and it repeats. And the pattern is different for different teachers, right? And showing up prepared for that teacher, prepared to get something out of that teacher's lecturing style, right, is actually a skill, is an art, right? And then you become more and more efficient in the way you acquire information from them. So that's a really important thing to do. So you've got your reading you've done, right? You've probably taken some notes on your reading. You've let that generate some questions. You bring the questions with you, and you have tried to imagine in some broad outline, some kind of sketch, what's going to happen for 45 minutes when you show up for class, right? That's a really, really useful thing to do. And I guess that's sort of, if you think about a page, right, that's sort of like the vertical orientation of the page, because your notes are going to kind of progress down the page, right? And then the next page, and you'll be going this way from top to bottom, from page to page. But here's a little trick. that I would encourage you to use is to take every page of notes that you make, and even if you do it on your computers, right? Just take the page and fold it in two. Put a little line down the middle. Here are my notes, right? But just put a little line down the middle so you have two columns, right? And then devote the left-hand column or the right, whichever you like, right? It's your notes, right? But devote one of those columns to what the speaker is actually saying, right? To the content of the lecture. Again, develop some kind of system that lets you distinguish between what they say, sorry, what you're interpreting them to say, so what they mean, and what they actually said, so that you clearly mark when it's a quotation and when it's your just interpretation of what they said. But that's really what's going to happen down that left-hand column. And it can be a really, really good idea to time index that. Because it doesn't have to be like, look at your clock and what time was it when this was said, but just sort of how many minutes into the lecture was it, right? So you kind of get a sense of how many minutes in you were. And again, blank space, and you'll see we'll generate blank space in a different way in a second. But blank space here as you're moving through the lecture also tells you something about what's going on. It could be either you were not paying attention, could be that they were not saying anything interesting that was worth writing down, right? And it could certainly be that they were saying something so interesting that you forgot to take notes, right? That's also a possibility, yeah. So keep that in mind. And if you're time indexing, then that kind of gives you some ways of putting in blank space that during these 5 minutes, I didn't make any notes. So that's quite a useful thing to do. But then there's the other column. And in the other column, you put your thoughts and reactions, right? And this way you don't need to use that square bracket system, right? You just, because everything in the right-hand column is not something that the speaker said or the teacher said. It's thoughts you had, questions that occurred to you, right? Things that you that you wanted to talk about, that it made you think about. And of course, we can imagine, and I'm not even sure that this is a disastrous lecture, but it's just a particular way of listening to a lecture, is that you have a lecture that has nothing in the left-hand column and a whole bunch of thoughts of your own in the right-hand column. So you spent the whole lecture just letting the speaker inspire you to think your own thoughts. And maybe just a few little stray remarks, little phrases that they said, some memorable phrases that they said, maybe some references they made to literature that you thought were interesting. So you're going to note those down, and then your thoughts, your kind of your inner monologue there. If you design your notes that way, so all of the notes for all of your lectures have this nice separation between what was I told, right? What was said in the lecture, and what did I think about it? Then you've really got a nice, again, immediate visual representation of the lecture. And you can just look, you'll notice also that some of your lecturers will generate one kind of notes that look a certain kind of way, right? And some other lecturers will generate a completely different kind of notes. An important thing that I would say that this two-column system also immediately reminds you of is that there is that task of what am I thinking, right? That is a question you should ask yourself, right? As I'm listening to this, what thoughts are occurring to me? What are my thoughts on this? So it is not, taking notes in a lecture is not just transcribing what was said in the lecture. You're not producing a transcript, right? You are making notes of your lecture, of the lecture you're attending. And I really do, the reason that I say this, sorry, is that the lecture is not simply a future reading task, right? Listening to a lecture is not producing a transcript that you then have to read at some later time. And now you have a reading task, right? You're supposed to actually get something out of the lecture. The listening itself is where you are getting something, right? And then just like a conversation, you're supposed to afterwards, you're supposed to reflect on it and think about it using your notes as a support for that process, right? So you need a record, not of just what was said, right? You need a record of what happened to you when you were listening, right? I'm just very quickly going to check the questions. Two good questions. So, well, one of them is, I guess, a big philosophical question. Why do we listen according to you in general? Like, why listen at all? Why bother, right? I think listening is a way of getting access to another person's experience. And in an academic setting, there's so much shared experience in the sense of we are studying the same kinds of subject matter, we're reading the same texts, right? We're all trying to understand the same phenomena in the world, and we are in general affected by the same events, same current events, right? So when we listen to somebody else, we should be really engaged in what is another human being making of all of this, right? And so if we're listening to a fellow student in conversation, or listening to a peer in a seminar, or listening to an authority, a lecturer teach, or an expert hold a public lecture, what we're doing is we're saying, how is some other human being making sense of the same things that I'm making sense of, right? And so we're getting access to that. I think that's really, really important. That is why we listen, and that's why we listen actively and with curiosity, right? Maybe this is a little bit sentimental, but I think we like hearing other human beings' voices. It's the universe is a lonely place. It's nice to hear voices that are making sounds that we can understand, right? And when we get both some feeling out of it and some information out of it, right? So we're listening to feel not alone in the world. I think that's another good general reason to do it. So it's to get access to another person's experiences and to confirm our place in the world that we listen. And then a very practical question, or a rhetorical question, maybe. It's not a rhetorical question in that sense. It's a question about rhetoric, but it's not a rhetorical question. And do you advise that we ask questions even if we know the answer during a lecture or presentation? I would not advise you to ask a question simply for the purpose of getting that answer articulated, as though you're deciding what needs to be said in this lecture. So you're just asking a question, you're assuming the lecturer will know the answer, and you think all your fellow students should know this answer to this question. I wouldn't suggest that. So let the teacher decide what needs to be said, and maybe even let the other students be as knowledgeable as you. Maybe the reason it's not being said is that everybody else knows the answer too, right? So that's certainly, so I wouldn't advise that. But I would say that if you articulate a question and you think you know what the speaker will, how the speaker will answer that, even if it's a question of what is the speaker's opinion on this, right? And you have a pretty good sense of what the speaker will say, satisfying your curiosity about whether you're right in what the speaker will say is a legitimate reason to ask a question, right? Of course, what you want to do is make sure that you frame it not maybe as a yes or no question, right? But as a question with a short answer that you think you know what will be, and then you're just testing whether or not you were right that they would say this in response to the question that you're asking. Getting that kind of validation and confirmation is certainly a legitimate thing to do when you ask questions. So I hope that captures the spirit of that question. As far as whether or not you should do it during a lecture or presentation, really get to know your teachers. Some teachers will say, feel free to ask a question anytime that it occurs to you. But the first time that anybody does that, you realize, okay, well, that totally destroys the order of the lecture. And so they're being nice and saying it, but it actually ends up making the class less effective than it would have been if we just saved our questions for the end, right? Whereas others are really, really good at it. And in fact, the lecture becomes much better when we prod them and poke at them along the way, right? So get to know the speaker in that sense. But certainly if it's some guest lecturer that's speaking, that you only hear them once, and so you can't do that kind of thing, then just take literally whatever they say. So if they say, please interrupt me along the way, then do, if you feel you have a good reason. And if they say, please keep your questions for the end, then do also follow that, right? I mean, I think that's mainly just kind of decorum and politeness. But like I say, as you get to know people, you can be a little more sophisticated than that, and you know what effect your question will have, right? And that's part of your listening ability. One of the things that I've been emphasizing in every talk, and I will emphasize it again here as a concluding remark to this talk, is that being good at something is being able to find the pleasure in it. It's being able to enjoy it, right? So if you want to become a good listener, right, what you have to do is put yourself in situations where listening is a relevant activity. So you do that. But then give yourself the sort of perspective on that situation, the sort of calm, the sort of order you need to enjoy it, right? To really say, well, some things can be hard to enjoy. If your lecturer just reads from a prepared manuscript, that can be a very difficult thing to enjoy. But it happens often enough in academia that it's worth saying, okay, all right, recognizable situation. I know what's going to happen for the next 45 minutes. This text is going to be read out loud. How am I going to enjoy it? Well, first, I'm going to fold my piece of paper, right? Some of the things I'll be writing down over here, some of the things that are said, I'll be listening for really nice phrasings of things. And since it's a prepared manuscript, so it's going to be a little bit boring, but maybe some of those phrases are going to be quite nice if you really think about it, right? If you're really listening. So I'll be looking for that source of pleasure. And then since it's happening in a nice, orderly, monotone kind of way, I have all the time in the world to sit and think my own thoughts, and I'm going to write them down on the right-hand column, right? So, all right, I know how to enjoy these next 45 minutes, right? I know how to not make them insufferably boring, right? That's part of my skill set as a listener, right? And that's not something you learn just by deciding that you want to learn it. That's something you work at, right? You work at not being bored in a boring lecture, right? You work at being able to listen to the things that are being said and enjoying that experience and deriving pleasure from it. The more your learning activities give you pleasure, the more pleasurable your university experience will be. And I would say that is a value in its, for its own sake, that is valuable. But certainly, I don't think I need to tell you that it will probably help you to learn as well, right? It will probably, if you are having a reasonably good time in the various predictable activities that are happening in a university experience, then you will come out of that experience having learned more. Right? And that's the art. That is what we're trying to do.